She found him where the red earth cracked with thirst, a man bleached by the sun and forgotten by the sky. He was little more than a whisper of a thing, a heap of bone and ragged cloth that the wind had not yet bothered to claim. To her son, Yiska, he was a curiosity, a strange pale stone upturned by a careless god. To her daughter Shandi, he was a source of a deep and silent fear, her small hand gripping the worn fabric of her mother's skirt. But to Nijoni, he was a ghost, not of the dead, but of the living. A ghost of a world that had taken everything from her, and now, in a final act of cruel irony, had left one of its own broken at her feet. She had seen death before. She had held it in her own hands when it took her husband Chi, leaving her with nothing but the echo of his breath and 2 children with his eyes. This man, this Bilagana, was an omen. His presence disturbed the sacred balance of the land, a land that already asked too much of her. Her mind, a fortress built of grief and necessity, screamed at her to walk away. Leave him for the coyotes. Leave him for the sun that had already begun its work. It was the law of this place. The weak do not survive. And yet his chest moved. A shallow, ragged flutter, like the wing of a trapped bird. It was a movement so small, so insignificant in the vast, indifferent expanse of the Dineta, but it was enough. It was a spark of life that called to the part of her she thought had died with Chi, the part that knew mercy. To save him was to invite a storm into her home. To leave him was to surrender a piece of her own soul to the unforgiving dust. The sun beat down, a merciless hammer. Her children watched her, their faces unreadable, waiting for her judgment. In the profound silence of the desert, Nijoni knelt. Before we journey into the heart of this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe for more tales that explore the depths of the human spirit. Getting him back to the Hogan was a prayer of pure endurance. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight that seemed to carry the sorrow of the entire world. She and Yiska, a boy whose shoulders were still too narrow for such burdens, dragged him across the unforgiving terrain, his boots scoring 2 parallel lines in the dust, a temporary scar upon the land. Shandi trailed behind, her small face a mask of anxiety, her eyes darting towards the horizon as if expecting more ghosts to appear. Inside the circular walls of her home, the air was thick with the scent of cedar and earth. It was a sacred space, a womb of safety she had fiercely protected since Chi's passing. Laying the stranger on a sheepskin near the cold fire pit felt like a violation, a desecration. He was a foreign body, his pale skin and unfamiliar clothes, a stark contrast to the dark, earthen tones of her life. As the day bled into night, he began to burn with fever. He thrashed and muttered, his words a broken river of English that meant nothing to her but carried a universal tone of torment. A name tumbled from his lips again and again. Anna. It was a sound sharp with loss. Listening to him, Nijoni was pulled back into a memory she kept locked away. She saw Chi, his body slick with sweat, his eyes clouded with the fever that would eventually steal his spirit. She remembered the smell of the herbs she had boiled, their fragrant steam a useless offering against a relentless sickness. She remembered the terrifying stillness when his muttering finally ceased. Was this why she had saved him? Was she trying to bargain with her own past to succeed where she had once failed? Was she trying to save this stranger, or was she merely trying to quiet the ghost of her own husband? The man on the floor groaned, and the illusion shattered. This was not Chi. This was a white man, a man whose people had drawn lines on maps and declared her home a reservation, a cage. She looked at her children, huddled together on the other side of the Hogan. Yiska's gaze was hard, his father's son. Shandi's was soft, her mother's daughter. In their eyes she saw the terrifying weight of her decision. He woke not to the world, but to the scent of juniper smoke, and the quiet rhythmic scrape of a knife against wood. His eyes, the color of a washed-out sky, fluttered open, taking in the curved, mud-plastered walls and the unfamiliar angles of the roof. There was a woman, her back to him, her long dark hair tied in a traditional bun. She was carving something, her movements patient and deliberate. He tried to speak, but his throat was a desert, and only a dry rasp emerged. The sound made her pause. She did not turn immediately. Instead, her shoulders tensed, a silent acknowledgement of the shift in the room. The stranger was no longer a sleeping burden. He was a conscious presence. When she finally faced him, her expression was unreadable, a landscape carved by hardship. She offered him a dipper of water without a word, her movements economical and devoid of sentiment. He drank, the cool liquid a miracle on his cracked lips. He saw the stark poverty of her home, the worn sheepskins, the simple clay pots, the meager pile of firewood. But he also saw a profound and resilient dignity in the way she carried herself, in the deliberate order of her world. He was an intruder here, a disruption to this fragile peace. The first days of his consciousness were steeped in a heavy silence, a chasm of language and culture that felt as wide and desolate as the land outside. He learned her name, Nijoni, and the names of her children, Yiska and Shandi, sounds that felt foreign and sacred on his tongue. He tried to convey his own name, Silas, but the word felt hollow, a relic from a life he could no longer claim. He knew he was a debt she could not afford. So he began to pay in the only currency he had, labor. He rose, his body still a fragile cage of aches, and carried a bucket of water from the well. He used the axe he found leaning against the hogan to split firewood, the rhythmic thud of the blade a stark new sound in the quiet air. They were small acts, simple gestures, but they were all he could offer. He was not asking for a place here. He was trying to earn the air he breathed. Nijoni watched him, her dark eyes missing nothing. She watched him move, watched him work, watched him interact with her children from a respectful distance. She was still weighing him, judging him. The question remained, a constant silent hum beneath the surface of their days. Was he a man to be trusted, or was he just a different kind of storm? A routine, unspoken and fragile, began to form, weaving their separate lives into a shared rhythm. Silas would rise with the sun, his work a silent apology for his presence. He mended the broken fence of the sheep corral with surprising skill, his hands, though blistered, moving with a forgotten competence. He learned the subtle language of her flock, the way to guide them to sparse patches of grass without alarm. He learned the patterns of her days, which were dictated not by a clock but by the sun, the wind, and the needs of her children. Communication remained a thing of gestures, and single essential words exchanged like precious coins. Wood, water, sheep. He learned the Diné word for thank you, ahehe, and the first time he said it, Nijoni paused her weaving, a flicker of surprise in her eyes before the mask of stoicism fell back into place. It was a small crack in the wall of silence that stood between them. But the world outside the hogan was not silent. It had eyes, and it had a long memory. One afternoon, an old woman appeared at the doorway, her face a beautiful, creased map of 100 hard seasons. It was Todi, her late husband's aunt, an elder whose words carried the weight of generations. She ignored Silas completely, her gaze fixed on Nijoni as she spoke in rapid, sharp-edged Diné. Her voice was a torrent of warnings, a history lesson steeped in pain. She spoke of the long walk, of broken treaties, of bilaganas, who came with smiles and left with everything. To harbor one, she hissed, was to invite the coyote into the sheep pen. It was a betrayal not just of Chi's memory, but of their people. Nijoni stood tall, her face impassive, but Silas could feel the weight of the old woman's words pressing down on her, on the very air in the hogan. He did not understand the language, but he understood the accusation. He was a symbol of a deep and justified mistrust. When Todi finally left, a profound quiet descended, heavier than before. Nijoni did not look at him. She returned to her loom, her hands moving with a fierce, angry precision, weaving threads of red and black, the colors of wound and sorrow. He was no longer just a man she had saved. He was a conflict she had brought upon herself, a living embodiment of the war between her compassion and her history. The ghosts of his past did not wait for an invitation. They came for him in the dead of night, clawing their way out of the depths of his sleep. Nijoni was startled awake by a cry, a sound of such raw anguish that it seemed to tear the fabric of the silent darkness. It was Silas. He was thrashing on his sheepskin, his body rigid with a terror she could not see. He was fighting something, pleading with it. And then came the name again, the one she had heard in the fever dreams, but this time it was a desperate, broken sob. "Anna! Forgive me, Anna!" He spoke in a frantic cascade of English, words tumbling over each other in a confession meant for no one. The fire. I couldn't get to you. The words were meaningless sounds to Nijoni, but the emotion behind them was a language she knew intimately. It was the language of irreversible loss, of a moment in time that becomes a life sentence. She lay perfectly still in the darkness, her own breath caught in her throat, an unwilling witness to his private hell. He was not just a drifter, not just a man down on his luck. He was a man fleeing a fire, a man haunted by a woman he could not save. The knowledge settled in her like a stone. It did not make her trust him more, but it changed the nature of her distrust. He was no longer a blank page, a symbol of a hostile people. He was a man carrying his own ashes. He woke with a gasp, his body slick with sweat, the phantom smell of smoke in his nostrils. He saw her watching him from across the hogan, her dark eyes luminous in the pre-dawn light. There was no pity in her gaze, but there was something else, a flicker of recognition, a quiet understanding. He felt a wave of shame so profound it was like drowning. He had brought his ghosts into her sacred home. He turned away, unable to meet her eyes, and the silence that returned was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the terrible, unspoken weight of their shared sorrows. They were two people from different worlds, bound not by words, but by the ghosts they kept. The journey to the trading post was a necessity they could no longer avoid. The flour was gone, the salt was low, and Yiska needed new soles for his worn-out shoes. It was the first time Nijoni and Silas would appear together in the white man's world, and the air in the old wagon was thick with an unspoken tension. The post was a low, dusty building, a nexus of two cultures that met mostly in transactions of commerce and quiet contempt. The moment they stepped inside, Nijoni felt the familiar shift. She became smaller, less visible. Her presence endured rather than welcomed. The trader, Mr. Gable, a man with a perpetually sour face and eyes that measured everyone by their worth in dollars, gave her a curt nod, but his gaze lingered on Silas. It was a look of appraisal, of a strange, masculine camaraderie that automatically excluded her. "Found yourself some help, I see," Gable said, his tone suggesting something more than employment. Silas said nothing, his face tightening. He stood slightly behind Nijoni, a silent, watchful presence. As Nijoni bartered for her goods, her voice low and steady, a pair of ranchers came in, their spurs jingling on the wooden floor. They saw Silas, then Nijoni and her children, and one of them let out a low chuckle. "Looks like he's gone native," the man said to his friend, his voice loud enough to carry through the small store. Shandi flinched, moving closer to her mother. Yiska's small jaw was set in a hard line. Nijoni ignored them, her face a carefully constructed mask of indifference. It was a poison she had learned to swallow her entire life. But Silas moved. He didn't raise his voice or make a threat. He simply took a step forward, placing himself between the ranchers and the family. He met the man's eyes, and his own gaze was as cold and hard as winter stone. "She has a name," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable authority. "And these are her children." The rancher, surprised by the direct, unwavering challenge from one of his own, stammered for a moment before turning away with a grunt. The exchange was over in seconds, but the room was charged with its impact. Mr. Gable looked on with renewed interest. On the long, silent ride home, Nijoni did not thank him, but she kept glancing at the set of his jaw, at the man who had stood up in a world that had always demanded she sit down. That evening, the world seemed to hold its breath. The children slept, their breathing a soft rhythmic tide in the quiet hogan. Outside, the sky was a deep velvet black, punctured by a spray of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The fire in the central pit had burned down to glowing embers, casting a warm, flickering light on Silas's face. The tension from the trading post had followed them home, but it had changed, softened into something else. It was Silas who finally broke the silence, his voice low, as if not to disturb the sleeping universe. He wasn't looking at her, but at the embers, as if seeing pictures in the flames. "I had a farm once," he began, the words tasting rusty in his mouth. "Good land. A house I built with my own hands." He paused, and Nijoni knew this was not a story he told often. "My wife, Anna, She loved the wildflowers that grew by the creek. He didn't speak of the fire. He didn't need to. The empty space where the rest of the story should have been was a wound in itself. He spoke of the life before the loss, which was sometimes the hardest part to remember. Nijoni listened, her hands still in her lap. The loom stood silent in the corner. When he finished, the quiet that returned was not empty. It was waiting. She thought of Chi, of the way his hands felt when he'd held hers, the calluses from his work with the horses, the gentleness in his touch. "He taught our son how to read the tracks in the dust," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He said you could read the whole story of the day if you just knew how to look." It was not a conversation. It was an offering, an exchange of polished stones of grief, held up to the firelight for a brief sacred moment. For the first time, she was not just seeing a white man, a Bilagana. She was seeing a man who, like her, had been hollowed out by loss. She saw the farm he had built and the wildflowers by the creek, and in his silence he saw the man who could read stories in the dust. The great lonely expanse of the desert that surrounded them no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a witness. The past did not send a warning. It arrived on a wave of dust and the hard, rhythmic beat of horses' hooves. Two men reined in their mounts a short distance from the hogan, their figures sharp and menacing against the afternoon sun. They were not lawmen. They were lean and weathered, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much and cared about too little. They were relics from Silas's other life, the one he had tried to outrun. One of them, a man with a jagged scar across his cheek, dismounted and swaggered forward. "Caleb," he called out, his voice a gravelly sneer. "We heard you fell off the face of the earth. Looks like you just fell into a different kind of hole." Silas emerged from the hogan, his body instantly rigid. He placed himself in front of the doorway, a human shield. "There's nothing for you here, Jeb," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "You need to leave." The second man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "That's not how this works, Caleb. You walked away from a debt, a big one. The boss ain't the forgiving type. We're here to collect what's owed." They weren't just talking about money. Nijoni could feel it. They were talking about a piece of him, a pound of flesh. They looked past Silas, their eyes sweeping over the hogan, over Nijoni, who now stood in the doorway with a cold, dismissive contempt. In their eyes, she and her home were nothing, just part of the scenery of this man's pathetic new life. "What's this?" Jeb sneered, gesturing with his chin toward Nijoni. "Playing house? You always did have a soft spot for lost causes." The insult was a physical blow. The violence of their world had finally crashed into hers. Yiska and Shandi were inside, their frightened silence a terrifying weight behind her. The men's aggression was a poison, seeping into the air, threatening to contaminate the fragile peace she and Silas had so carefully built. This was the storm she had feared from the very beginning. It had a name, and it had a face. This was the moment the earth held its breath. The two men took a step forward, their intentions clear. They were here to break him, to drag him back into the world of debt and violence he had fled. But then something shifted. Nijoni moved. She stepped out from the doorway of the hogan to stand beside Silas, not behind him. She did not carry a weapon. Her strength was not in iron, but in the earth beneath her feet. She began to speak, her voice clear and steady. She spoke in Diné, the words flowing from her with an ancient authority. The men, Jeb and his partner, could not understand a single word, but they understood the tone. It was not a plea. It was a declaration. It was the sound of a woman claiming her ground, her home, her family. She was telling them they were trespassers on sacred land, that the spirits of this place were watching, and that they were not welcome. As she spoke, a movement caught Jeb's eye. Yiska, small and swift, darted from behind the hogan. He held a long stick, and with a sharp, piercing cry that mimicked a hawk, he struck the rump of the men's tethered horses. The animals, already agitated, reared up in panic, their reins snapping free. It was the perfect diversion. In that moment of chaos, Silas made his choice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the one thing he had left from his former life, a heavy silver pocket watch, its casing worn smooth with time. "This was my father's," he said, his voice thick with the weight of the sacrifice. He tossed it to Jeb. "It's all I have. It's all you'll ever get from me. Now go." He was cutting the final cord. He was giving them his history, his inheritance, so that he could claim his future. Jeb caught the watch. His eyes narrowed. He looked from the watch to Silas, then to the unyielding woman beside him, and the boy who stood fiercely by the corral. He saw not a broken man, but a man who had chosen. He saw a fortress he could not breach. With a curse, he mounted his spooked horse. "It ain't over, Caleb," he spat. But they both knew it was. As the two men rode away, disappearing back into the dust from which they came, a profound silence fell. It was the silence of survival, the silence of a battle won not with fists, but with an unbreakable, unspoken love. The dust settled. The sound of the retreating horses faded into the vast, indifferent quiet of the desert. For a long moment, no one moved. Nizhoni, Silas, and Yiska stood together under the wide-open sky, a silent trinity forged in the crucible of the last few minutes. There were no words of thanks, no grand declarations. None were needed. He had laid his past down like a sacrifice, and she had stood with him, a shield of ancestral strength. The look that passed between them was a covenant, a marriage of two wounded spirits who had found their home not in a place, but in each other. It was a promise whispered on the wind, witnessed by the silent mesas. Life did not become easy. The sun was still relentless, the rain still fickle, and the world outside her small patch of earth still full of prejudice and hardship. But the landscape of their lives had fundamentally changed. The Hogan was no longer just her shelter. It was their home. A few months later, the rhythm of their life was a quiet, steady hum. Silas, now thinner but with a strength in his shoulders that hadn't been there before, was teaching Yiska how to brace the wagon wheel, his voice patient and low. Inside, the rhythmic clack of the loom was a constant heartbeat. Shandi sat beside her mother, her small hands learning to guide the shuttle, her eyes full of concentration. Silas would often pause his work to watch them, a quiet awe on his face as Nizhoni's hands moved with an artist's grace, weaving patterns of beauty and resilience from simple strands of wool. He was no longer a ghost or a burden. He was part of the pattern. One evening, as the sky turned a deep bruised purple, Nizhoni stood at the door of the Hogan, looking out at the land. It was still a harsh and demanding place, a land of sharp edges and stark beauty, but it no longer felt empty. It was not a place of mere survival anymore. With Silas by her side, and the sound of her children's quiet laughter inside, it had become a place of profound and stubborn hope. They had not conquered the wilderness. They had simply learned to plant a garden in it.